Hello, my name is Larry Ginrich, and I'm happy to serve as the Director of Communications and Engagement across Landis Communities, and I've been here for about 13 years. I'm glad that you can join and be thinking about this coming Sunday's Thinking Together in Sunday School. Last week, we looked around the call to serve together as a community and how to bear with one another in love, particularly when faith communities might be experiencing being torn apart or unwilling to work together. We're making a switch as we go into this week to be talking about rest. And so as we get ready to think about that together today, I wanted to take a time to rest and have a short prayer. God, we ask that you be here with us, and as we prepare for Sunday, that we might remember that we are called to rest. We can use the example that you have given us as you rested during the creation. And we ask this in your name, amen. Sabbath Rest for Human Beings is the title for today's lesson. And we look at several different perspectives. We look at the story of God resting after the 6 days of creation. We touch on the Israelites in the desert who were instructed to collect just enough manna to survive. And then we're to look also at Paul's perspective of the Sabbath, where we are to give out of our excess to those who don't have enough. So all of this wraps around the idea of how do we orient our lives to respond to the commandment to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. If you look on page 33, there's a quote from Ruth Haley Barton talking about Sabbath pauses. I found this to be very helpful, and she describes a Sabbath pause as a moment to rest in God between one activity and the next. Her encouragement is for each of us to practice these Sabbath pauses, to pause between activities and invite God to be present with you. She suggests maybe we replace some of our screen time with a Sabbath pause of a sort. She says there are simple means of introducing a Sabbath way of being into other days and moments of the week, affirming that Sabbath is a quality of time, way of being that is possible anytime and anywhere. And I would resonate with that. I would say some of my favorite Sabbath times have not necessarily been in the inside of a church building or in a worship service, but sometimes they have taken place when I'm driving or when I am in nature, one of the things that I enjoy doing. There's several background scriptures that are listed on page 32 that I'd like us to take a look at. The first is Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. And these are the verses that help us to have a background for what we will then look at in Exodus. It says, by the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing, so on that seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Then moving to the New Testament in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some of the heads of grain. The Pharisees said, "Look, why are they doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which was only for priests to eat. He also gave some to his companions. And then he said to them, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord of even the Sabbath." There's a number of questions in the leader guide that I would like to have you think on between now and Sunday. It may be something that leads you down a path to growing your own Sabbath time and thinking about how that Sabbath time may come together. Is it evident in your life that you see rest as the absence of work, or is it something more intentional than that? I know often when I come home from work, the last thing I want to do is look to see if there is dishes to be done or if the yard needs to be mowed. So is rest an absence of work, or is it something more intentional that you're doing with your time? Is it hard for you to stop and observe the Sabbath once a week? If so, why? What is it about you that is keeping this from becoming a part of your routine? And one that I think about a lot, how do you make the transition between work and Sabbath? That is particularly difficult for those of us who work in jobs and positions where we need to be connected at all times. Recently, here at Landis Homes, there was a situation with computer outages that needed to be addressed, and it needed to be addressed during the Sabbath. We kept working during those times, but we were also instructed and encouraged to find ways to make up that time so that we did, in fact, get our rest. I thought next it would be helpful to go and look at the scripture that they gave us for today, and you can find that in your booklets on page 32. This is from Exodus chapter 16, verses 22 to 30. And it really lays out how the Old Testament followers of God were to work and when they were to rest. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Today is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath. Bake what you want to bake, boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning, just as Moses commanded them, and it did not rot, and there were no maggots in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you won't find anything out in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none." On the 7th day, some of them went out to look, and they found none. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. Don't leave your place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. And while this was in the Old Testament, certainly as we look at the scriptures and dig into it in preparation for Sunday school, I think it's clear that this was something that isn't just meant for the Old Testament. We need to dig into that and see where the history of Sabbath comes from, but we also need to think about what it means for us today, and hopefully we can do that. Turning to page 34, where you see the introduction, says this study begins a unit on rest by looking at the practice of Sabbath rest. The word Sabbath comes from the biblical Hebrew, which has both a verb form meaning stop or rest and a noun form, Shabbat, that refers to the 7th day as a day of rest. Jews observe Saturday as a day of rest. Some Christians, like Seventh-day Adventists, also observe Saturday as a Sabbath. But for most Christians who observe Sabbath, Sunday is their day of rest. The Sabbath rest is rooted in the Genesis creation account. I think this is key, particularly it would have been for the Old Testament times, where after 6 days of labor, God halts the work and says, "Remember how I rested, you should rest also." And if you think about it, if you worked from daybreak to nightfall as a subsistence farmer, if you worked from daybreak to nightfall as a slave, you were going to need a break. This commandment would be something that would be very helpful. And it's notable, I think, as the helps say here, that Sabbath was being celebrated and being directed by God even before the Ten Commandments came along. So this predates the Ten Commandments. They are receiving this in the early days out of Egypt and enslavement. The Sinai covenant is still ahead of them, and yet they have this command from God to rest. That's something that I think we all look at and wonder what is supposed to happen on our Sabbath day. One question you might ask is, why is the commandment helpful? And then another question is, how has this been challenging to us or misused? And when I was a child, I know many of you would have done the same. We read the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. And it made a big impression upon me when I read the story of Almanzo Wilder and his siblings. Their parents were part of a very traditionalist group of people back then who believed very strongly that absolutely no work should be done on the Sabbath and no fun should be had on the Sabbath. And so there's the story of them sitting in the room during winter, and when their dad falls asleep, they sneak out the door and decide it will be time to take a few runs down the snow hill on their sled. Unfortunately for them, a pig had gotten loose and ended up on top of their sled, making a lot of noise and waking their father. And he talks about the consequences of his actions. It always was a story that sort of puzzled me, but then also helped me to understand the context in which I grew up in, where there were several things that were forbidden on the Sabbath. My parents had made the choice never to eat in a restaurant on Sunday. My parents had made the choice that Sundays weren't for doing our normal activities. We did not mow the lawn on Sunday. We did not work in the garden on Sunday. We did not wash our clothes on Sunday, even though some of our other Christian neighbors would have. I remember it was a big topic of conversation when me and several of my friends and cousins asked if we could go play basketball every Sunday afternoon down at the local school. We saw it as an acceptable way to burn off some energy and to improve our basketball games. While our parents weren't always so sure about it, they relented and allowed us to do that. But they specifically asked that we not go to McDonald's afterward and get something to eat. And so very early on in my life, I was exposed to this idea of what do we do around this Sabbath? How do we keep it? How do we work at this? I never had to go out and collect food for each day and then spend a day trusting in God for that. But this was one way that I thought of that it impacted me in my everyday life. But I think it goes beyond just the absence of something. I think it's pretty clear that in the New Testament, Paul is quoting this Exodus, but he's doing it in the context of what's happening in Jerusalem and what's happening in Corinth. Particularly, and if you look at page 35 in your book, you'll find some about this. In chapter 8, Apostle Paul quotes Exodus and says, this is one of the reasons that you should support the people in Jerusalem. He talks about the Corinthians' abundance and the need for a balance, saying, for I do not mean there should be relief for others and hardship for you, but it is a question of equality between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may also supply your need, in order that there may be equality. As it is written, one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. Back in Exodus, that was the same case. You were instructed to gather enough for your family, but not to hoard it, not to keep it, so that everyone would have what they need. That's what Paul was looking at from his reflection on this Exodus story. I would encourage you between now and Sunday's class to be thinking about what is helpful about this perspective that Paul is giving, but also to ask some questions. I know one of the ones that I come up with was Paul doing this because it was a way to ensure that this community that was very counter to its larger culture in that it allowed equality to exist between free people and enslaved peoples, between males and females, between young and old. By doing this and pointing back to the Old Testament, Paul was giving an opportunity for rest that could truly be rest for everyone, not just those who had affluence. That can be a challenging call to those of us who do have significant resources. It can also be misused from time to time. And so I think it's important to have us wrestle in these upcoming days with how to read Paul's use of the Exodus story to the New Testament church. Certainly, you can see some of this reflected in our own Christian traditions. Many groups have different understandings of what is and is not a part of the Sabbath day. As mentioned earlier, we don't even all agree on which day that is to be celebrated. But most Christian traditions do make room for a change or a Sabbath from the things that happen on a day-to-day basis. I'd also like to point out that as they do on page 36, rest is good. Rest is positive, and rest should not just be the absence of work. I think that's pretty important for us as we are driven in the things that we do to remember. It isn't just that we aren't working. It is to be something that is positive and regenerative. Vacation shouldn't be just about leaving one routine for another hectic routine. It should be about recharging and getting ourselves ready for the coming week. They quote on page 36 Rabbi Abraham Joseph Henschel saying, "On the seventh day, God creates tranquility, serenity, peace, and purpose." I will say that those aren't words necessarily that I'm used to thinking about when I'm thinking about Sabbath, although the serenity and repose certainly pop out to me as one who enjoys a Sunday afternoon nap. Also in 2 Corinthians, it's this idea of Paul making space for everyone to rest. How do our congregation's Sabbath practices do that? How do we work at that with our pastors, with our lay leaders? I know there are times when my family has to do maybe the nursery during the worship service, and then we're teaching the youth group class, and immediately after the youth group class is done, we run and take our turn covering in the library. Is that really a Sabbath? Should we be looking at a different way of doing church so that everyone can get a rest? And certainly encourage a pastor or a lay leader to have a time away if they are working on Sunday to help the rest of us have a Sabbath that is meaningful and useful. Where it sometimes gets really difficult to talk about in our culture is the Sabbath economics, as it's listed on page 37. They talk about the writer Ched Myers, who really leans into this idea of Sabbath economics. He says the biblical Sabbath instruction is a social ethic that has to do with our attitudes toward wealth and possessions, saying if we Christians trivialize and even profane the Sabbath, if we merely see it as a day to do as little as possible, or as an antiquity Jewish code of nitpicky prohibitions, this Sabbath was to represent God's strategy for teaching Israel about its independence or its dependence on the land as a gift to share equitably, not as a possession to exploit. I would certainly, as the book says, encourage us to think about that. And what does that mean for our time and our Sabbath and our work? As you go through the rest of this week and prepare for Sunday, think about where you are finding your moments of rest. How can we find ways to live into the commandment to work 6 days and observe rest on the Sabbath? When can we find time between our activities to serve as moments of rest between one activity and the next, instead of jumping from one to the other, and getting to the end of the day and realizing we have not taken a moment of rest? And then how can you find ways to adjust your lifestyle to ensure that others have enough so that they can experience rest and tranquility? If we truly believe that Christianity is for everyone, we need to think together about how everyone gets to experience rest and tranquility. So, as you go forward from this week, I hope that you take with you to your Sunday school class this idea of how we conform to what was called for way back predating the Ten Commandments. And then next week, we're going to lean into it even further, where we talk about what does Sabbath mean for others when we are experiencing our own Sabbath. And I encourage you to be a part of that conversation as well. So let's close with a prayer. God, as we get ready for Sunday, we ask that you would help us to learn how to better adjust our lives to honor you by observing the Sabbath. Help us to think about ways that we can ensure that folks around us have an opportunity to experience Sabbath, and certainly that we would pray for those who do need to be working on the Sabbath so that they would find ways to experience Sabbath time away from Sunday itself. Thank you for the way that you influence our lives through our experiences, and that we may take from those new ways to think about Sabbath, no matter our age or no matter our position. And we ask this in your name. Amen. Thank you.